Hello everyone! In today's video, I make some progress on the Prerunner build, and I begin working on the electronics that I'm going to be using in the Firebird. Alright, so the Prerunner build is back on the bench. I had an opportunity to do some work on it over these past few days. Those of you who are new to the channel or have not seen this project before, this is just a casual, laid-back, fun build I started several months ago and I've been gradually making some progress on. I'm using a cheap, almost hobby-grade Fighter 1 1/12 scale short course truck as a base and an old 72 Chevy body I had just sitting around. My goal for this project is to build a Prerunner style truck. I'll be sure to provide a link to the playlist for this project below in the description. I started off by doing some sanding on the cage and roof rack pieces, in preparation for painting. I usually like to sand the entire surface of a part prior to painting when using a resin coating like I did here. I will still use the file in a few spots where the resin was a bit thick, like in some of the corners. I got several questions on the last video regarding why I chose to use a resin coating as opposed to using acetone to smooth the surface of these parts. I chose a resin coating because I wanted to print these parts in PLA rather than a material such as ABS, which can easily be smoothed with acetone vapor. I don't do a whole lot of printing in ABS, so none of my printers are really set up for it, and when I do print something in ABS, it's usually just a relatively small, simple part. But for a large print like these cage pieces, which require a lot of time and material to produce, I prefer to use PLA since it's much easier for me to print, and it's far less likely I'll encounter any warping or any other issues while printing. Also, as a positive side effect of using a resin coating, it helps strengthen and stiffen the cage. But if I had the means of reliably printing these cage pieces in ABS plastic, I would definitely consider doing so and choosing a method such as acetone vapor smoothing to achieve a nice surface finish, since that would cut down the amount of time spent sanding. I will be showing some other processes for smoothing 3D printed parts, including using acetone in future videos. Right after sanding, I sprayed a few light coats of primer. I ended up running out of the primer I was using for the cab piece, so I used a different brand for the rear section. That's why they're two different colors. With the cage pieces looking good, I next did a little bit of work on the body. I decided it would be easier and look better to cut out the windows prior to painting the body, and then install my own after the body has been painted. At first I started cutting the windows out with a knife, but this body was made from some thick polycarbonate, so for the sake of saving time and effort, I just used a rotary tool to hack away the windows. I'll still do a little bit more sanding around the edge before I paint the body. On the chassis, I decided to reinstall the front body mount since I'll be utilizing it to secure the front of the body. I've been brainstorming some ideas about where I want to place the battery. I decided to mount it on the very front. To secure it, I designed and printed a custom battery mount. For a while now, I've received a lot of comments from people who want me to show more of the design process for creating parts, and from those who want to learn how to be able to design and print their own custom parts for their RC vehicles. I thought this battery mount would be a great part to demonstrate the design process I used to create it, and to demonstrate just how easy it is to create simple custom parts for your vehicle with just basic CAD knowledge. This is by no means meant to be a step-by-step follow-along tutorial or anything like that, just kind of a general overview of how I went about designing this part. Hopefully this will help those of you who want to create your own custom parts get some ideas and inspiration. I started by measuring the dimensions of the battery pack so I would know how big I needed to make the mount. With those dimensions, I began making a simple sketch using CAD software. To design this part, I decided to use Autodesk Fusion 360, but a simple part like this could be easily made using just about any 3D modeling software. When designing this part, I made sure that there would be plenty of room for the battery, so I oversized the interior cavity by at least 2 or 3 millimeters to ensure that the battery wouldn't fit too tight. In this situation, I wanted to lean on the side of having the battery holder being a bit larger than what I needed. If the battery ends up being a bit of a loose fit, and I end up needing to use a little bit of foam on the inside for padding, it's not a big deal. But if I lean towards the side of making this holder as tight and snug fitting as possible, I run the risk of making the battery too small and having to reprint the part. I can be a lot more relaxed about the dimensions and tolerances when I'm making sure there is plenty of room. While modeling the part, I thought it would be cool to make the front of the mount look a bit like a radiator, so I incorporated that into the design. One thing that I think is very important when doing any kind of design work, especially if you are a beginner, is to always start with a basic sketch before you start modeling, whether it be just with a pencil and paper or within sketching or drafting software. I often like to get my ideas out onto paper and kind of come up with a plan of how I want the part to look, what functionality it needs to have, and things like that before I start modeling the part in CAD. And also, I'll often be able to identify some potential issues or areas where I can make improvements to the design just from a rough sketch. Now, since this part is very simple and I had a pretty clear idea of how I wanted it to look in my mind, I didn't end up sketching anything out, I just dove straight into the design. I'm very pleased with how this part turned out. The only thing that I forgot to do was add at least 1 or 2 additional magnets to the opposite side of the cover, but as you'll see, I end up using a little bit of tape to act as a hinge, so it's not an issue. The slicing software I used ended up removing 2 of the fins on the radiator, which I didn't notice until after the part was printed, but regardless, I think it still looks fine. In total, I spent less than 10 minutes designing the part, and it took about an hour to print, and I'm very pleased with the finished result. I wanted to demonstrate just how easy it is to make a custom part like this with just basic CAD knowledge and a standard FDM 3D printer. With those 2 things, you can create all kinds of useful parts for your builds. I'm also going to be making a mount for this, which is going to screw onto the front of the chassis, which you'll see in a minute. I wanted to make the battery holder and the piece that secures it to the chassis to be 2 separate pieces, because it'll be a lot easier to simply secure the mount to the chassis and then glue the battery holder to the mount, rather than making it one piece and having to worry about the precise position of where the mount is located. Again, the chassis mount is a very simple design. I decided to add a loop to the top in case I wanted to use it as a tie down for the wires. I went ahead and screwed the mount to the front of the chassis. Before gluing the battery holder to the mount, I first used a bit of super glue to secure the magnets for the side door. As I mentioned earlier, I should have put a few magnets on the other side of the battery door, but I just used a small piece of tape to secure it. To secure the battery holder to the mount, I used shoe glue as an adhesive. I wanted to work on the position of the body. I needed to remove some material from the back side of the cab so the body will sit lower on the chassis. I marked the position of the slipper clutch shaft and used a rotary tool to remove material. PLA is not the nicest thing to sand since it tends to get soft and melt while being sanded at high speeds, but the sanding drum cuts through it like butter. I checked to see how well it fits with the cage in place. I did need to remove a section around the slipper clutch shaft, but I'm going to try to avoid removing any material from any other sections of the cage that runs along the back side of the cab. I noticed that the rear cage section was sitting a bit too high, so I needed to sand down the posts that sit on the chassis. At first I used a file to sand around the raised center section, but doing this was a bit tedious, so I just cut off the ends and used a rotary tool to sand down that section of the cage until it's at the height that I want. I'll add new guideposts to replace the ends that I cut off later on. After a bit of sanding, I got the rear section of the cage to sit at the height that I think looks good. I'm not a huge fan of the grille that's on this truck right now. It's a nice design on the full-scale trucks, but since this one's molded polycarbonate, it doesn't have a very realistic appearance. I decided to design and print my own grille. The one I designed is more reminiscent of the grilles used on 1967 to 1970 Chevy trucks. I printed the grille you see here using an FDM 3D printer and PLA plastic to act as a prototype and to test the fitment. I will probably be reprinting this using an SLA printer once I verify that the grille looks and fits how I want it. I cut the bumper and grille away from the rest of the body. Although it's probably obvious, I won't be using this bumper either. I will be making my own custom designed one. After cutting it away, I wanted to get an idea of how much material I needed to sand away with the sanding drum in order to get the grille to fit properly. It looks like I did a good job of designing the grille. It fits perfectly and I think it looks much better than the old one. I'm already really liking how this truck is turning out, and I can't wait to add some wide fender flares and bedside pieces and paint the body. I wanted to spend a bit of time this evening working on the electronics that I'm going to be using in the 1/24 scale Firebird that I'm converting into an RC drift car. What you see here are the smallest components that I had on hand that I knew would be compatible and hopefully will work well in this car. The receiver is a Radiolink R4EH-H. If you've been following me for a while, you know I use these along with the RC4G transmitter on all kinds of different applications. They're cheap, versatile, and have some great functionality. I'll be using a 180 mAh 2-cell LiPo battery, although I also have some 300 mAh batteries I'll probably be using as well if I can get them to fit so I can get a little longer runtime. I think this is like a 2 or 2.5 gram servo. It's quite small and compact, but it's got some good torque. I don't recall any details about this ESC, but it does have a brake and reverse, which is great for this application. And for a motor, I'm using this high torque 130 size DC motor. The first thing I wanted to do was test out all the electronics and bind the transmitter to the receiver. I'm using a different servo, motor, and battery for this, since they have the right connectors for the ESC and receiver I'm using. I've already verified that the servo, battery, and motor I'll be using in the Firebird work, and I'll be changing out the connectors on the battery and servo and wiring the motor later on. With everything binded and working as it should, I moved on to figuring out how exactly I was going to mount all the electronics to the Firebird. As I've mentioned before, I wanted to keep the interior tub intact and make the car look as scale as possible. At a glance, this receiver might seem like a terrible choice due to how big it is in comparison to the car. However, when the outer case is removed, the actual receiver itself is not that large, and I should be able to squeeze it into the Firebird without issue. The length of the antenna is a bit of a nuisance, but on previous builds I've just curled it up so it's out of the way, and I've never had any interference issues, so I should be able to do the same on this car. I spent quite a bit of time placing the components in different areas of the car to see where they would fit best. I figured the best place for the receiver would be in the back, over the rear axle, around where the fuel tank would be on a full-size car, and I would place the battery next to that receiver just behind the rear bumper piece. I'm going to be making some minor modifications to the ESC later on, which will help it to fit better into the car. Obviously, the motor will be placed in the front, in the same general areas where the engine would be on a full-size car, and the servo is going to be placed in the front, but I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to place the ESC. After some brainstorming and deliberation, I decided the two best options would be to squeeze it in between the door and door panel on the side of the car and make a small hole on the side of the interior tub so it would fit, or place it under the dash. I decided that placing it under the dash would be the best spot for it. In order to get it to fit, I will need to cut a large chunk of the firewall out of the body and remove part of the transmission tunnel. This is no issue though, since I was going to do this anyways in order to have ample space to fit the motor and transmission. With the decision made, I began the process of removing those sections. I wanted to remove the dash from the interior tub so I would have better access to the transmission tunnel. The two outer notches came loose no problem, but the lower center section of the dash where the radio and climate controls are is solidly attached to the interior tub. If I forced the dash out, it would probably end up damaging it, so I decided to just work around it. I cut through the plastic using side cutters and a hobby knife, and I used a rotary tool to grind it down further. It's looking like a great spot to keep the ESC, although I will have to watch out for heat. I used a file to give the edge a little more of a smooth, clean look. To help save some space and make the ESC easier to mount, I did some rewiring. I started by removing the on-off switch and replacing it with a small wire. This means that whenever the battery is plugged in, the ESC will be on, but I'd rather have the space than have the switch. I might wire in a much smaller switch sometime in the future. Rather than just using the ESC's JST connector to plug into the motor, I'm just going to wire the motor straight to the ESC. Of course, this will make swapping motors a little more of a hassle, but JST RCY connectors are just too big for this car. I might fit some smaller connectors in the future. After these modifications, I wanted to once again test the ESC to make sure it was still working properly before going any further, and as you can see, everything is working as it should. Along with working on the electronics, I've also been working on the front suspension and steering as well. I've begun printing some parts as you can see here. I designed this front K-member piece so that it will fit in exactly the same place that the K-member piece included with the kit fits. This not only makes it easy to mount and very scale looking, but it will also help to ensure that it is aligned properly. I've still got more design work and printing to do for the front suspension and steering components, as well as some more work to do on the electronics. But hopefully I can make a lot of progress this upcoming week and have at least the front suspension and the electronics mounted in time for next week's video. I have a few brief things I'd like to mention before concluding this video. For those of you who aren't aware, I'm currently doing a giveaway of these 1/10 scale RC accessories. I explain how you can enter for a chance to win these in last week's video. Also, this week I'm going to make it a point to add a Facebook group to the Make It RC Facebook page. I talked a little bit about this before, and I know some of you have been requesting that I create one. My goal for this group is to be a place to showcase and discuss custom RC builds, 3D printing, model building, RC videos, and things like that. And I'd also like to showcase some of the projects and videos from this group and give the creators a shout out in future videos. Also, as I'm getting closer to releasing chassis kits, this group would be a great place to collect feedback, suggestions, and share ideas. I'll talk more about this in next week's video. And one final thing, so far I'm really liking the new format, and I'm going to continue to stick with it for at least several more months and see if I still prefer it. But I'm going to continue uploading videos for series that I've already started. For example, I will be making a part 2 video for the Firebird and Scale Garage build, and a part 3 video for the Prerunner project, and a part 5 for the Budget Drift build once I've made a bit more progress on these projects. I'm doing it just so these series that I've already started last year have some sort of conclusion and don't just end on part 1 or part 2. I will not be doing this for projects that I've started in the last video or projects that I will be doing in the future, such as the R32 Skyline build or CMX Bronco build. I'll just be showing the progress I make in these weekly videos, and then once the project is complete, I'll do one separate full build video for that project. I know I've talked about this before, but I just want to let you know so in the coming weeks, when you see a Firebird Drift build part 2 or a Prerunner build part 3 video, none of the content in that video will be anything new if you've been watching these weekly videos. I'm only uploading a separate video so that pre-existing series has a conclusion. I'm going to either upload these videos at the exact same time I upload these weekly updates, or choose not to have the video show up in anybody's subscription feed when I upload it, since I don't want to give off the impression that I'm just re-uploading content for the sake of algorithms or spamming or anything like that. Hopefully that makes sense, but thank you all for watching and making it to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.